and local government should be doing together. And my understanding is that that is exactly what they are doing together in the context of Galway.
Thank you. Taoiseach Deputy Ruth Coppinger, please.
Thank you, Ceann Corla. And other parties have begun by referring to Joanne Hayes, and I would like to express the hope that political parties that contributed to the atmosphere of that time, to the witch hunt of that woman, will draw the necessary lessons that women should have privacy and autonomy over their own lives. Now, Taoiseach, 5 weeks ago, the All-Party Oireachtas Committee voted that we should have a referendum to repeal, a simple repeal of the 8th Amendment, and that abortion will be legalised up to 12 weeks without restriction. This was the culmination of a process that was set up by your government, but people are none the wiser as to the simple question: is the government now going to accept or set aside the recommendations of that committee? Later today, many young people are expected to assemble at the Dáil as part of the Strike for Repeal movement. They want to listen to the debate, and the questions that they want answered are simple. Now, these young people know nothing of the Ireland we got a glimpse of yesterday, of dead babies on beaches, of Salem trials of a woman. What they believe in is bodily autonomy. They won't accept politicians procrastinating, and they're the people who will actually face crisis pregnancies in the future. So the questions we need answered are: is it the government's intention to honour the Taoiseach's commitment for a referendum in late May? And in order to meet that time frame, will your government do 3 necessary things? Number 1, will you move the first stage of a repeal referendum bill late next week? Number 2, will you set up the Referendum Commission, which has asked for 16 weeks in which to operate? And number 3, will you publish legislation that contains abortion up to 12 weeks on request? Now, 4 weeks ago, the committee report was published, and for the number of deputies who haven't had time to read it, you think they were asked to read War and Peace rather than a short report. As is usual, when it comes to the rights of women and the decisions of women, TDs are wrestling with their consciences in a way they never do about cutting hospital beds or bailing out banks. But it's women who should be allowed to examine their consciences about this decision. That is the reality, not politicians. Let's worry about whether people with crisis pregnancies can sleep at night rather than Taoiseachs or TDs. And this really should be simple for politicians. Do you, as Professor Arul Kumaran said at the committee, do you support legal or legal abortion? That's the simple question. And do you want to force people to remain pregnant? That's all you have to ask yourself. Societal attitudes have moved on considerably. There is now a new middle ground, and even if there wasn't a majority now for abortion rights, 60% in the last Red C poll, parliaments have to legislate for societal need and reality. So, Taoiseach, in summary, my question is this: for the young people who will gather at 5 o'clock, will you respect the recommendations of the Oireachtas Committee? Will you give a date when the repeal bill will be first moved through this House, allowing the Referendum Commission to be established? And will you ensure that legislation gives real abortion rights regardless of your own personal opinions? Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
Thank you for that question, Deputy. First of all, in relation to the timeline and in terms of what the government needs to do, the Taoiseach has made it clear that the government is committed to a referendum, but there is a procedure that needs to be followed to ensure that that becomes a reality. This is something that we agreed as a government as a 3-step process quite some time ago. We would set up a citizens' assembly who did a very good job. And then the recommendations from that process would go before an Oireachtas committee, who I also think did a very good job, debating and discussing and making recommendations. There wasn't unanimous agreement, but there was majority agreement. And the third part of that process that we committed to was the government would then consider, following a debate in the Oireachtas, the recommendations of that report and make a determination in terms of how a referendum should proceed and what question would be. Following a debate in the Oireachtas, the recommendations of that report and make a determination in terms of how a referendum should proceed and what question would be asked. And we are moving through that process, and that we are now at the start of the third stage of it. The timeline for procedural steps compiled by the Department of Health envisages a series of memoranda being submitted to Government in the period of late January to early March. Subject to Government approval of each memorandum in turn, it's proposed that a constitutional amendment bill must be initiated and passed by both Houses during the period of March to mid-April. A referendum commission must also be established, subject to Government approval. Previous commissions have indicated that 4 months is required for a commission to do its work properly. A referendum must be held not earlier than 30 days and not later than 90 days after the constitutional amendment bill has passed the Houses of the Oireachtas and a polling day has been agreed on. And of course, in parallel with that, we have committed to putting together at least the heads of a piece of legislation to try to set a context around the answering of the question that people will rightly ask if they vote to either remove a section of the Constitution or replace it with something else. What will the reality be after that in terms of legislative certainty? And that is a question that people will want answers to. We are beginning a detailed debate in this House this evening. I don't think we should be drawing conclusions before that debate even starts, Deputy, which is what you seem to be suggesting we should be doing in terms of making commitments. The Government wants to hear what all parties and all contributors to that debate have to say, and then the Government will have to make decisions around the Cabinet table in terms of how we proceed.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Coppinger.
Obviously, it's reasonable for the whole Oireachtas to have a debate on this issue. I have no problem with that. When that debate is finished today and tomorrow, my question is this. If we're to meet the time frame of May 25th, which I think everybody would agree is an optimal time to have a referendum allowing young people, students, etc., vote before exams, etc., begin, we need to have about 6 weeks for the repeal bill to move through the Dáil. That was according to advice given to the Government before the committee sat. Now, if there's new information that's saying we don't need that, so that's why I'm raising it now. The hemming and hawing that's taken place from the Taoiseach and from many others isn't giving any confidence that that will actually happen. The second issue is this. I actually agree that legislation should be published on abortion. And the reason I agree is this. I have no confidence that this Dáil, with its current make-up, could actually be trusted to enact that legislation unless it gets a public endorsement in this referendum. So I think people should know what they're voting for, and I'm actually confident that they will accept it.
Thank you, Deputy.
But the key issue now is, will you meet those timelines? There's a simple repeal bill. We all know it's a very simple bill, 1 or 2 lines. And we've got one here. If you don't want to move it next week, maybe Solidarity and People Before Profit will move it ourselves next week.
Thank you very much. Taoiseach, to conclude, please.
I'm not sure that would be conducive to this House moving forward together if opposition parties are going to start trying to force the pace on something. What we're trying to do here, and I think what the Taoiseach has given great leadership on, is to try and recognise the fact that there are differences of opinion that are deeply held, linked to people's personal circumstances and experience. Many in this House have very strong views in relation to these issues, in the context of the need to protect women in a more comprehensive way than we do today, but also in the context of the responsibilities we have towards children and unborn children. And we are, as a government, trying to bring forward a proposal that can allow the people of Ireland to make an informed decision in terms of what they are deciding on as regards our Constitution, and also the consequences, if they make a decision to change the Constitution, what the new realities will look like. That's complicated. It's not straightforward. It requires legal advice from the AG, and it requires thoughtful political debate that listens to everybody's perspective.
Thank you, Tom.
And then tries to come up with an approach that I hope all parties will be able to support, so that we try to take the party politics out of a very divisive and difficult and emotive issue.
Thank you very much.
That is what the Taoiseach is trying to give leadership on, and I think so far he's done a good job on that. and we will try to meet the timeline that he has set in terms of trying to ensure that we have a referendum in late May or early June. He's the one who has tried to put a process in place that can get us there in that timeline, and the government will act on the basis of that.
Thank you, Taoiseach. That concludes leaders.